What if I told you R. Kelly wasn't the R&B genius we all thought he was? What if, behind the hits like Bump and Grind and Ignition, there was a much darker, manipulative side that nobody saw coming? You see, R. Kelly wasn't just the king of R&B, he was the puppet master, controlling everyone around him with a mix of charm, power, and secrecy. And what's worse, he used that power to hide the truth, manipulate his closest collaborators, and leave a trail of destruction in his wake. But here's the twist. The music industry knew more than they let on. The people around him, Public Announcement, Aaliyah, and even his closest allies, were all part of a carefully orchestrated facade. What did they really know? And why did they stay silent? Let's take you behind the scenes of R. Kelly's rise and fall. A world of deception, scandal, and betrayal, all hidden beneath the surface of his chart-topping success. And it's time to reveal what was really going on when the lights were off. R. Kelly's rise to fame was nothing short of meteoric. With hits like Bump and Grind and I Believe I Can Fly, he quickly became the face of R&B in the 90s, and the world bought into the narrative. The genius artist who came from humble beginnings, using his talent and charisma to charm his way to the top. The public adored him. They saw him as a misunderstood artist, a man who overcame adversity to make it big. It was a story that fit the classic American dream template, and the media played right into it. But what most people didn't know, what the public didn't see, was the darker side of Kelly's journey. Beneath the surface of his musical genius was a man who knew exactly how to manipulate his image, control his inner circle, and keep the truth buried. R. Kelly wasn't just the lovable, shy genius we saw on stage. He was a master at creating a persona, one that served to mask the power he wielded behind closed doors. So how did this misconception take root? Well, for starters, R. Kelly was brilliant at playing the role. He surrounded himself with yes men and people who were willing to turn a blind eye to the things they knew, or worse, the things they didn't ask about. Everyone was too caught up in the music, the fame, and the success to pay attention to the whispers behind the scenes. And why would they? When you've got a hit song every other month, why question anything? He made it easy for the world to fall for the idea that he was just a talented, misunderstood man trying to find his way. But what if it was all a setup? What if, all along, R. Kelly knew exactly how to use his charm and celebrity to get away with things most people would never even think to do? This wasn't just a tale of success. It was the beginning of a much darker reality. And the truth was buried so deep that even those who worked with him, people like the members of Public Announcement, were blindsided by what would eventually come to light. The myth of R. Kelly wasn't just the story of a musical genius, it was the story of a man who knew how to manipulate the truth to stay in control. And that was only the beginning. Here's the cold, hard truth. R. Kelly wasn't the untouchable genius we were all led to believe. Sure, he had an ear for music and a voice that could melt hearts, but let's not pretend that his success was all about pure talent. There was more to his rise than just his musical abilities. He used his genius for manipulation, control, and frankly, abuse. People call him a musical prodigy, a gifted artist, but let's get real. What R. Kelly excelled at wasn't just making hits. It was using his position of power to create a web of lies and deceit. He wasn't just writing songs. He was crafting a persona, a myth, a genius in the public eye who had the world at his feet. But behind the scenes, there were darker forces at play. The fact is, R. Kelly wasn't a solo act. He surrounded himself with talented individuals, yes, but these weren't just his bandmates. These were people he manipulated into his orbit. Public Announcement, a group he helped form, initially wasn't meant to be his stepping stone to superstardom. Yet, that's exactly what it became. His vehicle to control, his way to keep the spotlight on him while quietly pushing his narrative. Let's talk about his relationship with the members of Public Announcement, guys like Dre and Rick. Early on, things seemed perfect. The group was doing shows, recording hits, and everything seemed like the beginning of a major R&B legacy. But the deeper they got into the R. Kelly machine, the more they began to notice strange things behind the curtain. Kelly wasn't just a bandmate. He was a dictator, controlling every move, every note, every step. He didn't just want them to sing his songs. He wanted them to stay in their lane and stay loyal to him at all costs. Remember, R. Kelly didn't let anyone see the real him. He created a facade, an illusion of the perfect artist, the perfect mentor. But the reality? He was pulling the strings behind the scenes, using his power and fame to create an empire that thrived on manipulation and silence. And the deeper he got into that world, the more the people around him started to question the price of their loyalty. What's worse, R. Kelly knew exactly how to use his celebrity status to cover up his personal demons. The public didn't care what was happening behind the scenes as long as the hits kept coming. And while his songs played on the radio, the truth about the man behind the music stayed hidden, buried under layers of charm and fame. So, was R. Kelly a genius? Sure, in the same way a master manipulator is genius at controlling their prey. But genius in music? Maybe not as much as people thought. It was all about the brand he built, a brand that distracted from his real intentions. And now, the music world is left with the ruins of a career built on deceit. R. Kelly was more than just a talented artist. He was a master of deception, and that's the real genius of his story. But here's where it gets really interesting. R. Kelly didn't just create hits. He created an empire built on secrecy, manipulation, and ultimately control. And the more you look at it, the more you realize that the myth of his genius wasn't just about the music. It was about the persona he crafted, one that allowed him to get away with things that most people couldn't even fathom. At the heart of this empire was his ability to keep people close while ensuring they never truly saw him for who he was. Take the case of Public Announcement. Those guys weren't just his bandmates, they were his pawns, kept in the dark about the true dynamics of the man they were working with. They were there, playing the role of his backup, supporting the genius behind the hits, all while R. Kelly was pulling the strings. What he wanted, they did. No questions asked. And when they started to ask questions, the tension began to mount. Let's take Rick and Dre, two of the key members of Public Announcement. At first, they were all in, doing everything to support R. Kelly's vision. But as time passed, things started to change. They noticed how Kelly controlled every aspect of their work, and more importantly, their personal lives. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about maintaining control over everything in his orbit, including them. This wasn't an artist in the traditional sense. This was someone using his position to create a world where he was the center of attention, and everyone else was just there to keep the illusion alive. But here's the real kicker. R. Kelly didn't just stop at controlling his bandmates. He was the puppet master for everyone around him, including the women he manipulated into his life. He wasn't just producing their music. He was controlling their futures, their choices, and ultimately, their silence. He knew exactly how to use his fame to hide his actions, while the people closest to him either turned a blind eye or became too deep into the system to escape. And why did no one ever speak up? Why didn't Public Announcement stand up earlier? The answer is simple: survival. R. Kelly had created an environment where saying no wasn't an option. He made it clear that stepping out of line meant losing everything: your career, your reputation, and your future. It wasn't just about loyalty to R. Kelly. It was about staying in the game, staying relevant, and staying paid. And that, in itself, is a tragedy. So, when we look back at R. Kelly's career and the rise of Public Announcement, it wasn't just a story about talent. It was about how a man used his genius to build a machine that allowed him to get away with things most of us can't even comprehend. And even those who were close to him, like Rick and Dre, found themselves caught in a system that made it almost impossible to escape. It wasn't just about making music, it was about maintaining power. And R. Kelly made sure no one ever questioned his control until it was too late. At the end of the day, the real tragedy isn't just the victims, it's the people who had a front row seat to it all, but were too afraid to speak up. Now let's talk about the evidence that proves R. Kelly's empire was built on control and not just musical talent. We can't ignore the testimony from Public Announcement members who were there, witnessing the dysfunction firsthand. Dre, Rick, and Earl, each one of them saw the cracks in R. Kelly's facade, and each one had their own reasons for either staying silent or walking away. And here's where the story gets even darker. When Earl Robinson left the group after claiming he saw R. Kelly and Aaliyah having sex on the tour bus, it wasn't just about the relationship. This was about a whole lot more than meets the eye. Earl's exit was just one example of how R. Kelly's actions weren't just affecting the women around him, they were destroying his relationships with those closest to him. After Earl left, the tension only grew within Public Announcement. The group members were stuck in a difficult position. They were part of something bigger, something that was financially rewarding, but they also started to realize the price they were paying in terms of their own integrity. And then there's the story of how R. Kelly handled his relationships with women in his camp, especially Aaliyah. The accusations of their relationship didn't just go away, they became the foundation of a larger pattern of manipulation. But what makes this even worse is how R. Kelly worked with the media and the public to keep his image intact while the truth was unraveling behind closed doors. He wasn't just hiding his actions, he was actively controlling the narrative around his career and personal life. He knew how to use his charm to distract people from the truth. Aaliyah wasn't just a young artist under his wing, she was a pawn in a much larger game. But the real kicker? The industry knew something was off. People saw the red flags and chose to ignore them. The infamous 18 and over signs held up at concerts were just the tip of the iceberg. The media might have been willing to brush things off, but those close to R. Kelly, whether they were working with him or in his camp, knew something wasn't right. Yet because R. Kelly was at the top of his game, and because his success was tied to their own, most people stayed silent. It wasn't about protecting the truth, it was about protecting their own interests. The more you dig into the timeline, the more obvious it becomes. R. Kelly was a man who knew exactly how to manipulate every situation to his advantage. Whether it was using his fame to lure in young women or keeping his colleagues in line through threats of ruining their careers, R. Kelly turned the music business into his personal empire. And while everyone else around him played along, it was clear that only a select few ever saw the real person behind the superstar. The longer you look at R. Kelly's career, the more you realize just how much he built on lies. He wasn't the innocent, misunderstood artist the world believed him to be. He was a man who used his talent as a shield to protect himself from the consequences of his actions, all while controlling the people around him. Whether it was keeping public announcement in the dark or manipulating his relationships with women like Aaliyah, R. Kelly didn't just break the rules, he made them. And the more you look at it, the more you realize just how far he was willing to go to maintain control. Now let's dive deeper into the web of manipulation and secrecy that R. Kelly spun over the years. The truth wasn't just buried in the music industry or in his personal relationships, it was deeply embedded in the way he controlled everything, from his public persona to his inner circle. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence comes from the infamous 18 and over signs at his concerts. You might remember these signs being displayed at his shows, and they were often linked to his predatory behavior. To the casual observer, it seemed like just a harmless gimmick, a playful part of the performance. But to those who were paying attention, it was a glaring red flag. It wasn't just a symbol of his sexualized lyrics. It was a warning that R. Kelly was normalizing the very thing that would eventually come to define him: his relationships with underage girls. The signs were one thing, but the truth behind the curtain was something far more insidious. While the public was distracted by the fame, the glamour, and the music, R. Kelly was busy creating an environment where silence and loyalty were mandatory. Anyone who got too close to the truth found themselves either forced out or silenced in one way or another. His control extended far beyond his immediate circle. It reached into the very foundation of the industry, where people turned a blind eye to his behavior in exchange for money, power, and fame. But here's where it gets even darker. R. Kelly's ability to manipulate his closest allies went far beyond just convincing people to stay quiet. He used their loyalty to fuel his empire. When people like Dre and Rick from public announcements started to get uncomfortable with what they were seeing, they found themselves stuck between a rock and a hard place. They couldn't just walk away. R. Kelly had made sure of that. Their careers, their reputations, and their livelihoods were all tied to him. And for many, leaving wasn't an option. It was too risky. So they stayed. They kept quiet. And R. Kelly knew they would. The idea of manipulation didn't just end with the group. Let's look at Aaliyah, one of the most tragic figures in this whole story. While we now know the details about their illegal marriage and the abuse she endured, it's crucial to understand just how R. Kelly groomed her for that relationship. Aaliyah wasn't just an artist to him. She was another victim in his system of control. And even after her death, the narrative around her and R. Kelly continued to be manipulated by those who still wanted to protect him. People were willing to sweep her pain under the rug in exchange for preserving the R. Kelly myth. As we go deeper into the manipulation, consider the stories of others who were involved with R. Kelly, women who were part of his inner circle, but who were also victims in their own right. R. Kelly was able to exploit their ambitions, their dreams, and their vulnerabilities. He preyed on their trust, promising them fame and success while ensuring that they would never escape his grip. And even those who tried to leave, like public announcement members, found that the path to freedom wasn't so simple. The more you tried to distance yourself, the more you realized how deeply you were enmeshed in his web. And let's not forget the people outside of his direct circle, the management, the label execs, and the industry insiders who turned a blind eye to everything that was happening. For years, R. Kelly's actions went unchecked because the people in power either didn't care or didn't want to know. After all, he was making money, and as we know, the music industry has a long history of protecting its cash cows, even at the expense of human decency. The further you dig into R. Kelly's life, the more you realize that he was never just a musical genius. He was a man who understood the power of control, how to manipulate the narrative, how to use people, and how to keep them locked in his world. His genius wasn't in his music, it was in his ability to deceive, to exploit, and to hide in plain sight. And the worst part? His actions didn't just hurt the women who came forward, they hurt everyone around him too. Because R. Kelly wasn't just a predator, he was a master manipulator who used his music, his fame, and his charm to keep people in line. And when they finally broke free, they had to deal with the fallout of being too close to a man who was much darker than they ever realized. At this point, the pattern of manipulation, control, and deceit is undeniable. But let's dive even deeper into how R. Kelly's empire was propped up by his calculated use of fear, secrecy, and influence over his inner circle. One of the most shocking aspects of R. Kelly's manipulation was his ability to isolate his victims and collaborators from the rest of the world, ensuring they stayed silent even when they knew something was wrong. This wasn't just about being a music mogul. It was about being a master of psychological control. R. Kelly didn't just isolate his victims physically. He did so mentally and emotionally as well. For example, let's look at his relationship with the women who were part of his world, both on and off the stage. The women who were closest to him weren't just his partners. They were his prisoners, kept under his thumb by a web of psychological manipulation. Many of these women, including those who later came forward, were trapped by the fear of losing everything they had been promised: fame, success, a future in the music industry. R. Kelly used their dreams against them, making them believe that their futures were intertwined with his success. But it wasn't just the women. R. Kelly extended this psychological control to the men around him as well. Dre and Rick from Public Announcement were part of the machine too. They weren't just working with him, they were complicit in maintaining the illusion of his genius. They saw the cracks in the facade, but they also saw the career and financial rewards that came with being in his orbit. Walking away wasn't an option. They had too much at stake, and R. Kelly knew it. And let's not forget the horrifying stories from the tour buses. We've heard about R. Kelly's sexual relationships with women, but what about his manipulation of the men who worked for him? When you're on the road, day in and day out, things start to become normalized. In R. Kelly's world, this meant turning a blind eye to the things that were happening behind closed doors. Whether it was young girls being invited onto tour buses or the emotional abuse that his closest collaborators endured. But what truly exposes the depth of R. Kelly's manipulation is the way he kept people loyal, even when they knew what he was doing. Take the situation with Dre and Rick. After the allegations came to light, many of the people who had worked with R. Kelly were left with a deep moral conflict. They knew what was going on, but they didn't speak out. Some walked away, but many stayed. They stayed because they had families to feed. They had careers that were tied to R. Kelly's success, and they had been conditioned to stay silent. The real evidence here is in the stories of those who lived through it. Rick and Dre, members of Public Announcement, had front row seats to R. Kelly's manipulations. They saw the way he controlled the women in his circle. They saw how the lies and deceit spread, but they were also victims of that same system. R. Kelly wasn't just abusing the women around him. He was also playing mind games with the people who should have been his friends and collaborators. What's truly horrifying is the way R. Kelly's success allowed him to get away with these behaviors for so long. As his fame grew, the people around him grew more afraid of losing what they had, whether it was their job, their career, or their financial security. And R. Kelly knew exactly how to use that fear to his advantage. He didn't just exploit his victims, he exploited the loyalty and fear of those closest to him. It's not just the women in R. Kelly's life who were manipulated, it was everyone who came into his orbit. Whether it was the artists who worked with him, the people behind the scenes, or even the people who tried to speak out, they all faced the same dilemma: speak out and risk everything, or stay quiet and live in fear. R. Kelly created a world where silence was the price of survival. The more you look at it, the more you realize that R. Kelly's control wasn't just about keeping his secrets. He was keeping his empire intact, no matter the cost. And for those who were too close to him to escape, the price of silence was a lifetime of complicity in the crimes he was committing. The bottom line here is simple. R. Kelly didn't just create a legacy of music. He created a culture of fear, manipulation, and silence that allowed him to operate unchecked for far too long. And while the music world may have celebrated his success, the people closest to him were living a very different reality. So, where does that leave us? What do we do with the story of R. Kelly? This man who was once hailed as a genius, but who, in reality, was nothing more than a master manipulator. The music he created, the career he built, and the empire he constructed weren't just about talent. They were about control, deception, and exploiting those who believed in him. He wasn't just a victim of his own success. He was the architect of his own downfall, a man who let his fame blind everyone to the horrors behind the scenes. The truth is, R. Kelly wasn't just the king of R&B. He was a predator who used his position of power to hide in plain sight. And while we can't rewrite history, we can now see the full picture of who he truly was. But the real question is, how many more R. Kellys are out there? How many more artists, managers, and industry insiders are willing to turn a blind eye to the manipulation and abuse that happens behind the closed doors of fame? As for the people who were caught up in his world, Public Announcement, Aaliyah, and all the others, maybe the best thing we can do is listen to their stories. Let their voices be heard so that we don't repeat the same mistakes. Because the truth is, there's always more than meets the eye when it comes to those at the top. And while R. Kelly's story may be one of the most dramatic, it's far from unique. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the stars we idolize are hiding the darkest truths. Don't let the fame fool you.